I don't think that there is the greatest driver of all time. Because if we think back in history, there's been Caracciola and Nuvolari, then there's been Fangio, maybe Jim Clark, maybe even a Jackie Stewart, but there's been a Niki Lauda for sure, an Alain Prost and an Ayrton Senna. In their time, they have all been the greatest of their period, of their era. But I don't believe there is one man who is the greatest of all time. But what makes a great driver? What makes a legend? Well, he has to have a talent that is God-given. It's not his own, it's a natural skill that he is gifted with. How those people manage that skill, how they manifest it, how they control it, makes the difference whether they will be the great drivers of their time.
Jackie's right, of course. Motorsport is such that it's even risky to compare the merits of drivers competing against one another. It's even more apt when those drivers haven't raced against one another and have driven under entirely different conditions. Consequently, it's quite impossible to say whether Georges Boileau was one of the greats, but he was, without doubt, the first of the early racers to earn hero status. He was the bravest of all these intrepid competitors who raced in blinding conditions on dusty circuits, driving unsophisticated, dangerously unwieldy and unstable, but already powerful machines. Boileau was leader of the Peugeot team and showed remarkable spirit and incredible bravery as he proudly and single-mindedly fought the armada of conquering Mercedes. This Franco-German battle reached its climax at the French Grand Prix at Lyon on July the 4th, 1914, where Mercedes' tortoise and hare tactic cost Boileau victory in the greatest race of his life. Within a month, however, war had broken out. The conflict would claim the life of Boileau, who was killed in the air over Verdun. When racing restarted early in the 1920s, the French were still at the forefront, with Delage and Bugatti, but the Germans were temporarily uncompetitive and were replaced by the Italians in their Fiats and Alfa Romeos. Felice Nazzaro was the most representative of their clan. Unlike Boileau, Nazzaro was less of a fighter than a stylist, more aware that one had to look after one's equipment to get the best from it. His career wasn't simply brilliant, but also enduring, lasting more than 2 decades. Nazzaro was Fiat's champion, but when they stopped racing at the start of the 20s, it was Alfa Romeo who took control with a formidable duo of drivers. Antonio Ascari, first of all, whose style was so flamboyant that it was frequently described as spectacular and even aerobatic by some contemporary commentators. However, he was killed racing in the wet ACF Grand Prix of 1925 at Montlhéry, at a corner which has borne his name ever since. The other half of the duo was Giuseppe Campari, a bull of a man who had the shape, desire, and maybe even the voice to become an opera singer. He adored eating snails, but fortunately his diet had no influence on his speed. His greatest win was in the ACF Grand Prix of 1924, when he beat Albert Divot and Delage driver Robert Benoit. But just like his teammate, Campari died racing. He had announced that the 1933 Monza Grand Prix would be his last, but he was killed on the very first lap when he lost control on an oil patch, which also claimed the lives of Borrachini and Krikowski. The 30s saw the return of Germany to the motor racing arena, and with their cars came a whole gaggle of drivers, of which the best was Rudi Caracciola, who had no equal in mastering the massive power of the Silver Arrows on the sinuous curves of the daunting Nürburgring. His style of driving was so elegant that it was almost boring to watch, so perfect and apparently easy was it. It made him almost incomparable in the wet and earned him the name Regenmeister. Thanks to the superiority of their equipment, the Third Reich's drivers almost gave the impression that they had been recruited as promoters of Nazi propaganda. But Caracciola had attracted admiration early in his career when he had demonstrated his generosity easing up rather than overtaking when his Alfa Romeo teammate began to run out of petrol when heading for victory in the 1932 Monaco Grand Prix. That teammate was an Italian, almost emaciated in stature, but huge in talent and status. His name was Tazio Nuvolari. He was a demon, said his rivals. This Mantovan drove with such obvious bravery and impudence that they maintained that he had to have a pact with the devil himself. He was the winner of 49 Grand Prix, but on the track he behaved as though he would never be beaten.
Era molto tecnico, lui aveva tante conoscenze tecniche e tutti i suoi grandi successi e la sua grande ascesa e la conservazione attraverso vari periodi, perché c'è stata una trasformazione grandissima da fine anni 20 all'anteguerra e anche all'immediato dopoguerra, e lui applicava sempre delle innovazioni alla sua tecnica di guida. La grande invenzione che se l'è trascinata fino ai tempi dell'Auto Union era la capacità di fare il drift, la scivolata su tutte le quattro ruote, in modo leggero, però già importante perché a quei tempi non si faceva.
The rear-engined 500 horsepower Auto Union was a real beast, but the frail-looking Nuvolari was up to the task of taming it, and he could dominate it like no other. But it was in an Alfa Romeo that Nuvolari won the greatest race of his life. In fact, it was in the 1935 German Grand Prix where he gave away 30 horsepower to the Silver Arrows. And in spite of the efficiency of the Mercedes organisation, which saw them gain more than a minute over the Italians in refuelling alone, the little Mantovan won an incredible victory, cocking a snoot at the Nazi dignitaries on their home ground. This champion, whose panache had no equal, perhaps only found a successor worthy of the name 3 decades later, in the shape of another small man with a similar attitude, fired by the same determination and spirit, the Canadian Gilles Villeneuve, who drove for Ferrari from 1978 to 1982. It was a meteoric but unforgettable career.
Di Gilles non si possa dire niente di più di quello che ha fatto vedere a tutti. Era molto generoso, un uomo di grande talento naturale e di grande coraggio, molto semplice, sempre all'attacco, anche quando doveva girare per strada per andare a prendere il gelato, andava forte, faceva i testacoda, si divertiva, principalmente si divertiva a fare il pilota.
Villeneuve's temperament was well known.
Io penso che per gli episodi che lui ha saputo far vedere agli altri, Gilles sia già un pilota di leggenda. Io voglio ricordare l'episodio, lo chiamavano il pilota volante, perché ha fatto un mare di incidenti all'inizio quando imparava. L'episodio di Zandvoort quando è rientrato al box su 3 ruote. Non era un pilota che si era costruito, un pilota così, naturale, era veloce, con qualsiasi tipo di macchina in qualsiasi situazione.
The most famous race in Villeneuve's sparkling career was his incredible wheel-to-wheel, and we mean sometimes wheel-against-wheel, battle with René Arnoux in the closing laps of the 1979 French Grand Prix at Dijon. This was a fight to the flag, both drivers desperate to beat the other. For second place, remember, and doing all that they could while staying just within the boundaries of sport and safety. It was a duel etched in the memories of all those who saw it, one of Formula One's greatest battles. But let's go back, chronologically speaking. When racing restarted in the late 40s, it was the older drivers whose careers had been interrupted by the war who featured. Nuvolari was in decline. The new stars were Giuseppe Farina, Jean-Pierre Vimy, Raymond Sommer, Luigi Villoresi, Alberto Ascari. In 1948, the Alfas dominated and Vimy won 2 out of the 4 major races that year. The future looked great for this Frenchman, but his career was cruelly cut short by his death when driving a Gordini at Buenos Aires at the end of the year. The driver who would become the most honoured in the history of the sport came from Argentina. Juan Manuel Fangio was certainly the most successful of the drivers in the 50s, and his record of 5 World Championship titles still stands today, more than 40 years after its inception in 1950. That first World Championship was won by the experienced driver Farina, the first driver to adopt a straight-arm driving technique. But when the Italian lost form, it was the Argentine who developed into a winner, and he took his revenge in having been beaten by Farina in 1950 by winning his first title the following year. Fangio certainly dominated his era, but he had a rival in the shape of the English driver Stirling Moss, the most talented of the new generation.